Hello, my name is Mark Stephen Wade, and I am an avid photographer, and I hope you become one too. Welcome again to the channel, and I just want to thank everybody for their support and for watching and for liking and all of that and subscribing as well. I really do appreciate that. Today we're going to get a little bit more deeper into aperture and what does it mean. And I'm going to get a little bit into some philosophy and maybe not philosophy, but what should you be thinking about, right? When you're going to make a piece of art with your photography, be it a portrait, landscape, some sort of wildlife or whatever, what do you want to see in your final image? What is it that you want to see? We're going to talk a little bit about aperture and why it's important to understand what happens when you pick your specific hole size for your photograph. Now, just really quick, you should hopefully already understand how to get proper exposure, at least how to get all the right settings for proper exposure. And we're going to talk about what proper exposure is in the next video. Right now, I just want you to kind of understand some basic knowledge and get to the point where you're controlling your own camera. So get your camera into manual mode, whatever that means. I can't go over every single camera and how that works. But you should be learning how to work in manual mode. So at some point when you decide to get out of manual mode, you'll understand why you're doing it. Now, excuse me, I need a little coffee. Gotta have my coffee. Sorry for this noisy chair. It started squeaking and it just hasn't stopped. So let's talk about aperture a little bit. You may ask, look, why do I have to care about it? Why do I care about it? Well, aperture, as we talked about, is just the hole that is made for the lens to let light through. And of course that goes out. But the important part is to understand how that affects the overall look of your photograph. And what I'm going to do here, I brought up this, I made a bunch of JPEGs, right? And I just made them at different, with the, let's see, I think that's the one, it was a Sony 85 1.8, I think was the lens. I'm pretty sure. I'll check it before I load this up. And I went with different apertures, and then I went with different distances. And this is something we have to understand, okay? Your depth of field is what will be in focus, right? So if you're like me a lot of times and you're using a long lens, say a telephoto of 400 or something like that, or 200 even, a lot of times your depth of field is very narrow already to begin with. But if you're using a really big hole, like a 2.8, right, or even an f4 on a long lens is pretty big, your depth of field even gets smaller and smaller. It gets shorter and shorter, and we have to understand where that plane of field is, right? When we point our camera at something, what's going to be in focus? If I'm at 1.4 and maybe I get a ½ inch to an inch or whatever it is, depending how close I am, of something in focus, I may only have the eye and the most of the face, maybe the nose in focus. Maybe the tip of the nose isn't even in focus at 1.4 or 1.2. Wow, think about that. So we're going to scroll through these photographs. I'm going to narrate it, and we're going to just basically talk about what happens when we close down the aperture very tight to a very tight hole, and when we open it wide up, say f16, or if we open it wide open to 1.8 or 2.8 or whatever, and what happens. So we're going to scroll through that, and then I'm going to have something to say about that. Okay, so here are some photos that I made. I was about 5 feet away from these roses with my 85 1.8 prime lens from Sony. And what I've got marked here are my basic 3 points of focus. My main focus on the left that you see there, that's my main focus. And then the rose on the right is just behind it a little bit. And it's out of focus. You can see it's not that far behind it. And at 1.8, it's out of focus. And then back behind there at the window jamb, that's about a meter behind the window, a little less than a meter. And it's way out of focus. So that is where we want to start for everything. And just note that at 1.8, I'm getting lots of light in there. And it's one of those things that is a preference when you're shooting indoors to have, a very large aperture like that, 1.8 or something, or 2.8, something like that. So what happens when I start? What if somebody's behind me and I need to get them behind this other person? Say those roses that's a person, and I get them in focus. But what if somebody's behind them? Or what if I'm in a room full of people and I want to get as much people as I can? Well, this next one jumps all the way up to f16, and you can see the difference is night and day. And of course, all of the roses are in focus. That window jamb is pretty well in focus, and you can see all the way into the backyard. And so, if you're in a room full of people and you want several people deep of people in focus, that's not a bad way to go. You just have to remember that once you start, if you're indoors at f16, you're going to probably need a flash, and we'll get into flash and what that means and everything. So here's the same shot at f8, and that does pretty well as well. And typically, if I'm indoors, if I have a flash, I typically won't go much over f8, just because it takes so much light. If you're going to shoot over f8 or f16 or some kind of crazy number like that, you need a lot of light in order to make that photograph work. It doesn't mean you can't, and we'll talk about artificial lighting before this is all done in the future anyway. So here we are at f22, and we're actually about 3 feet further back. So this is what I was talking about, aperture. When you're moving back, you're going to get a longer depth of field. I'm all the way up to f22, and you can see everything is in really good focus. Obviously, it's not perfect focus out there in the back, but it's perfectly acceptable for large groups and that sort of thing. And you can see the chair behind it, which is about a foot behind that rose on the left. It's well within focus for any kind of photography. But f22 is very, very tough for professional photography. It doesn't mean you can't do it if you have the right lighting available and that sort of thing. I've never done it, but if you want to carry a bunch of lights and get it done like that, you can. You can see that window jamb is completely in focus. Here we are at f16. That chair is a little more out of focus. Just we just opened up the hole a little bit to f16, and we can see that we're already losing focus in certain areas. And then when you move to f8, it's just about the same as what we saw with f16. So f8 is, like I say, that's kind of a go-to number, f6, 6.3 or 5.6, something like that for indoors. But again, I'm not using a flash, and that typically at f8 you'd be using a flash. With cameras today and their ability to eliminate noise, especially post, f8 is much more possible than it used to be. Here we are at f1.8 at that same 8-foot distance or so, And you can see that the chair is just only 1 foot behind those roses, which are in focus much better than before. But it's because I moved back that 3 feet. So sometimes just moving back will give you a better depth of field. But you can see everything behind the roses is out of focus. Okay, so that is just something to consider when you're making your photographs, and what the final output is to look like. Okay, so we've scrolled through these photographs and I've narrated it just so we can take a quick look. So what does that mean? Well, we have to imagine something, right? We have to imagine if I'm indoors and I want to make some portraits of the family, right? If it's one person, usually pretty simple, right? If I've got, even if I got low light, and I want to hit it at 1.8 or 2.8 or something like that, I can get the eye in focus, and it'd be a nice photograph. It'd be a great photograph. But at the same time, what if there are two people, like one person behind this person? When we use our camera phones, our selfies, those lenses and the dynamics of how that it's all set up typically tries to get everybody in focus, right? But when you're manually adjusting your camera, you have to understand the depth of field, especially when we are at a certain distance from people. And we need to make sure we understand that lens and how it works before we go off trying to make images of people. And so, so everybody who needs to be in focus is in focus. But the flip side of that is I have to ask, because I'm responsible for this photograph and the way I want it to look, I have to ask myself, do I want a blurry background? Because why do you want a blurry background? Well, when we start talking about composition, we're going to talk about isolating your subject. And a blurry background really helps to do that. I know, like with this particular camcorder that I'm using to record myself, it's awful for just putting everything in focus. But I don't care. Right now, it's not important to me. That part of the image just isn't that important. I'm not trying to get this great artistic look to it. I'm just conveying information. That's all I'm doing. So I just dispense with caring about the fact that the aperture is set so that it's trying to get everything in focus. I'm not trying to defeat what the camera does. But if I was doing some artistic photography with a family, with some portraits or that sort of thing, do I want the background in focus so I can actually add context? Or do I want it out of focus so I can isolate more that subject? And we're going to talk about isolating your subject and the importance of that at some point, just not today. So I want you to think about that. And then I just want to go over this with you guys as far as what I do. And I'm going to show you a quick little video of my backyard, right? Here's my backyard. And I just kind of walk around and I look at stuff, right? And I'm just going to shoot some flowers, right? I'm looking around and I see these flowers. They're white. There's a very strong contrast. And so here's some photographs with a very high aperture, say f/16 or whatever. And then here's, and I'm not caring about the background. And then here's some where I'm wanting to compress the background. And with compressing the background, you can either do it with a low aperture, or you can get very close to your subject and it will naturally compress what's in the background. It just happens that way. And if you have a zoom lens or a telephoto lens, it works even better. When you start wanting to compress your backgrounds, zoom lenses do really good at it. Now, I'm not saying you should do portraits with a zoom lens or anything like that, unless you want that effect. So I would just say on your practice, the next time you want to practice, take the lens that you like and learn it and understand what you're going to get as far as compression, and what you're going to get as far as when you have a wide open lens. What does your background look like, and what does that mean to you in the future when you want to make photographs? Not just portraits, but anything, because that's a choice you need to make, because that's going to affect the final outcome. Okay, thanks a lot for listening. Again, go ahead and take just this one time. Just practice your aperture and get to know your lens. Now, if you have a kit lens and if it starts at 5.6 or whatever, or 4, you may not be able to blur out the background really well, but learn it anyway. And you'll see the difference between a very small hole and a very large hole, and how that affects your overall output. And you need to take that and make those mental notes as to, okay, what do I do now when I want to make photographs? Do I want to blur out the background or don't I? And understand that when you get closer, you're going to compress things in the background even more. I say all that, and we're going to talk about some other things down the road about minimum focus, hyperfocus, and infinity, and what those mean. And we'll get into that when we start talking about focus and all of that. So thank you for listening. Go forth and be an avid photographer.